Test, 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 test.
I can hear you just fine, Jason.
Thank you.
Right there at the right at the grid. Back then, so yeah. Good morning. Good morning.
Yeah, I was just telling them that they stopped spraying water.
Welcome everybody to day 2 of the Mid-Atlantic Council's June 2022 meeting. I just want to say thanks for all the hard work yesterday. We have a full agenda before us today, so I'd like to call this meeting to order. So Wes Townsend, who's our vice chair, and I spoke this morning, and we decided that Wes is going to moderate and facilitate and chair the meeting for the morning session, and then I'll be back after lunch to pick up moderating and chairing after lunch. So we have a number of items on our agenda this morning. Wes is going to help us get through that. I would prefer, like I said yesterday, to be there with all of you, but some of the symptoms I'm having with the COVID is just taking me down a notch. So Wes absolutely is stepping up, and I think I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to be here, but I'd like to at this point turn the floor over to Wes to go ahead and kick off the meeting this morning. So Wes, it's all yours.
Thank you, Mike. Good morning, everyone. Let's start this morning off with the Atlantic Mackerel Rebuilding 2.0 and looking for final action. And Jason, whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Thank you. So again, final action today for Atlantic Mackerel Rebuilding, included in that setting 2023 specs are set as part of that process, including the river herring and shad cap, and there are some other management measures that we'll get into discussion of. So a little organization of this presentation. I'm going to touch on the assessments, little context with some recent past, talk about rebuilding generally and touching on uncertainty, a very high-level overview of the public and AP comments, and then get into the committee recommendations and council decisions. So, just kind of refreshing how we got here. We had in 2018 a benchmark, what's now called like a research track, but that was still the old process. It had data through 2016, and the stock was overfished, with overfishing occurring, and had been having overfishing occurring for quite some time. It really represented a drastic change in our perception of the productivity of the mackerel stock. I kind of went back digging through some FR notices and find that in '97, the quota was set at potentially a level that is 10 times what we now think the entire spawning stock biomass was. So like, a big change in perception of the stock. Now, it did, that assessment projected that the stock would rebound relatively quickly with biomass near 160,000 metric tons in 2019. So last year we got, in the new process, the kind of what used to be an assessment update is now called a management track assessment. So it still found overfished and overfishing through 2019. Instead of being at the predicted 160,000 metric tons, I'm doing some rounding here, but we're only at 40,000 metric tons. The trend was positive, almost tripling from 2014 to 2019, but still only a quarter rebuilt in 2019. And we'll kind of touch on this theme repeatedly, but I think that kind of highlights the inherent uncertainty in projecting forward for any stock, and mackerel in particular. So we implemented the first rebuilding plan, but there's almost no overlap between the first rebuilding plan's implementation and the data in this management track assessment. I think there's about 1 month of overlap in late 2019. And the catches that we've had since then have been below every alternative in that first rebuilding exercise. So regardless of whatever the council had chosen back in the first one, we'd basically be in the same place. Again, kind of looking at some recent history, we do seem to be headed in the right direction. The catch, so 14 to 19, the stock almost tripled. Again, still only a quarter rebuilt. The average catch over that period where it tripled was about 18,000 metric tons. And the average recruits coming in that period were about 155 million fish. So 168 million is kind of the median that goes into our targets where we're trying to get to. Since 2009, we've only seen 128 million recruits. And that is one of the potential assumptions of recruitment during rebuilding. But again, in this period where the stock seems to be headed at least in the right direction, those are the averages, about 18,000 metric tons of catch, and about 155 million recruits from 14 to 19. So now kind of going into the next rebuilding, there's first a few years since the 2019 the data in the management track, and next year, and that's 20, 21, 22. So catch over that period is averaged about 14,000 metric tons, actually a little bit lower than that because that has a higher than realistic value for 2022 built into that. And then the projections are only assuming that the recruits for those years are about 132 million fish. So again, a little bit higher than the 128, lower than the 168, but lower than the realized recruitment during that 14 to 19 period. So I think the hope is that by using these kind of lower, probably more realistic assumptions about recruitment, we won't be as likely to be as far off in this go around with projections. So the SSC recommended, kind of given the dependence upon recruitment, given the periodic nature of strong mackerel recruitment, kind of taking a long-term approach. So everything is kind of focused on the probability of rebuilding over 10 years. And like any stock, typical rebuilding will be dependent upon getting typical recruitment, or at least what's assumed in any given projection. Again, really just setting specs for 1 year. We're expecting a new mackerel management track assessment in 2023 that can be used to set for specs beyond 2023. So there are 5 kind of basic alternatives. They all rebuild in 10 years. The SSC has kind of endorsed those rebuilding plans and the ABCs in them as recommending best available science. That was kind of the term of reference 1 from the March SSC meeting. Make ABC recommendations given the different alternatives being explored by the council. We'll touch on that issue a little bit again later. 1 kind of assumes low recruitment for all 10 years. If you're only putting not very many fish in, but your target is based on a lot more fish coming in, it's very difficult to rebuild. So in that first one, you can have almost negligible catch for 10 years. It looks like you'd rebuild. Why? Because you're only putting in a small amount of fish each year compared to the rebuilding targets that are based on a higher level. The other 4 start at low recruitment and then kind of slowly build up as biomass increases. It's based on a trigger, half of the rebuilding target, but the way the projection program selects which recruitment to use, it's based on each individual little run. And in any given year, some of the runs are above half, some are below half. It's picking the higher or lower recruitment for each individual run. As biomass gets higher, more of the individual runs are above that threshold. So while it is kind of like a light switch for each run on or off, low or high recruitment, the effect is kind of a slow increase in assumed recruitment as biomass increases. As biomass increases, it really means more of those runs are hitting that threshold. So these are the biomass trajectories for the 5 rebuilding alternatives. One thing the SSC kind of was a general recommendation is if we can try to better communicate the uncertainty to the council, to the public, whoever. So worked with the center two ways to try to conceptualize that uncertainty. So I'm just going to focus on the P-star alternative here, just as an example, but the same general principle holds for all of them. So you can see at the right, like most of them, like all of them, they end up around rebuilt after 10 years. And we're looking at the yellow here. But there's quite a wide spread when you look at all the different runs, where they end up in 2032. You can see there's quite a wide spread, and that those dashed yellow lines, or the dashed lines for any of these runs, they're encompassing 90% of the runs. So 10% of the runs are outside those bounds, but these are 90% confidence intervals, which means that 90% of the runs stay in those bounds. The solid line, which we kind of use to determine, is rebuilding going to succeed or not, is the median, right? So half the runs are above that, half the runs are below that. So, when you see that endpoint, and I think it's hopefully we're trying to communicate, that there is a lot of uncertainty, and the way the projection works is when you come back here at the start, they start at 2,000 different places at the start. And then from each of those 2,000 places, they do 100 runs. And you can imagine, each run is getting a little different recruitment. It's starting in a little different place. Even if it starts in the same place, it's going to get different recruitment. And so you've got 200,000 of these runs going out into the future. And that is what makes up that spread you see there. Yes, and so there is this central tendency towards any of these being rebuilt, but there is a substantial amount of uncertainty. So another way that the SSC kind of suggested we think about it a bit is so this is the same information in that previous figure, but just 1 year, the terminal year. This is alternative 3 P-star. And this is a distribution of those 200,000 runs and where their biomasses end up in 2032, all the different all 200,000. And you can see here, P-star has a 52% chance of rebuilding according to the projections. So 48% of those 2,000 runs ended up below the rebuilding, and 52% of them end up above rebuilding. And some of them are, a little bit above, some are a lot above, but that's just kind of the nature of this, of projecting. This is alternative 4. And again, you can kind of see this one, 61% probability of rebuilding. What does that mean? 61% of those 2,000 runs are above the target. 39% of those 200,000 runs are below the target. One thing I mentioned in the memo, there was a kind of a curious observation here. The yellow dashed line for P-star seems to have the potential to go down to almost 0 stock size. And you see that in this figure too, there's this bimodal distribution, which was slightly odd, and quite a few of these runs appear to go to near 0 biomass, which was perplexing to me. And I think I figured it out. And that's, when you go back to this figure, when you use P-star, like this does, the projection program needs some probability of not overfishing in any given year. And what it does is it selects a probability based on the median for all 200,000 data points in a given year. So you have some of those runs that are trending low, but the median looks pretty good. So you have these low biomasses that have a fairly rosy P-star applied to them that outputs a fairly high catch. Now that's not how P-star would work in reality, but you start chasing 200,000 strings of possibility. It's kind of like enter the multiverse, right? I mean, so the projection program can't do that. Staff suggests in the future, it may be worth exploring how to reprogram that to follow how P-star would actually work. It's just kind of a limitation of the projection program. think the consequence is P-Star probably actually has a higher probability of rebuilding than the program calculates. Talking to the center lead, she, her intuition was also that same thing, that because of this artifact of how the program works and how it selects the P-Stars and applies P-Stars to low biomasses in a way that would not occur in reality, that the P-Star options are going to have a higher probability of rebuilding than is calculated. Again, the projection program isn't programmed to do that right now, but it seems worth exploring in the future. Okay, so some other thoughts on general rebuilding and uncertainty. So the SSC was asked for its March meeting to provide ABC recommendations for the council's rebuilding alternatives. And the SSC provided those ABC recommendations under term of reference 1, and that's what's in the public hearing document, is the basis of the ABCs. The council also asked in term of reference 2 to provide guidance regarding the relative risks associated with the different rebuilding alternatives. And as part of that TOR2, the SSC did make a recommendation, again, considering that risk thing from their perspective. P-Star was their recommended approach from that risk perspective. And so a little more information on the SSC's advice and some of the uncertainties that they wanted the council to be considering related to that term of reference was that those higher catches through the rebuilding are dependent on recruitment. And if we don't know if, when, or how that's going to occur, if we continue to get low recruitment, it's going to be very challenging to rebuild. It becomes very challenging to account for kind of these small catches. With very low catches, we're going to get minimal fishery dependent data and the assessment, right? That's what feeds the assessment, including the fishery independent data. Do you start to have more discards if you don't allow any landings? Does the fleet survive to get to the rebuilt, when the stock is generating more fish year to year? It gets very hard to kind of discern whether or not you're making actual progress with small amplitude changes in the SSB. Again, we've talked about there's a lot of uncertainty. Again, when we were just going 16 to 19, we saw a lot of uncertainty. Never mind when we're trying to go out to 2032 now. And identifying that a number of publications in literature suggests, if you definitely have a higher probability of succeeding as you get above 50% probabilities. It seems kind of like fairly self-evident, but they thought it was worth keeping in mind. So the SSC did recommend P-Star, kind of summarizing their rationale. Again, this was related to TOR2, not the TOR1 ABC TOR, but they noted it fulfills the rebuilding requirements, is responsive to information. It just kind of uptakes new information as assessments occur. It does have the highest 10-year catch yield. Again, I think part of that is related to this artifact of the projection methodology, because it's plugging in some high yields dependent upon actually no, sorry, scratch that. The high 10-year catch yield is just related to that it does allow a higher probability of overfishing as stock size increases out in the out years. It's consistent with the existing risk policy. Again, the council's risk policy right now says that if you have a rebuilding F and a standard P-Star calculation, the SSC will default to the standard P-Star. So in any rebuilding alternative like the committee's recommendation that generates a catch higher than the standard ABC, the council has to indicate that, and that's built into alternatives 4 and 5, that at least for this initiation of rebuilding, that it's kind of tweaking the risk policy. Doesn't want the SSC just to default to the standard P-Star. It wants to stick to the rebuilding catches. And then SSC also indicated that following P-Star is likely to reduce year-to-year changes in the ABC. So in all the public comments, hearing summaries, written comments are in the briefing documents, but a very wide range of public comments from folks who definitely are extremely confused that they're seeing more mackerel than they've ever seen before in their area. We're quite perplexed why the council's embarking on this action. Two folks who think we should move to a moratorium for some number of years on mackerel catch. So about as wide spectrum as you can imagine. A lot of concern about impacts to recreational fishing, especially for higher fishing and commercial tuna fishing that's dependent on mackerel for bait. Kind of flagging that there's a high socioeconomic cost, but maybe low biological impact given the relatively low historic recreational catches. Concern about ecosystem effects if mackerel is not rebuilt and not available as prey. And then again, part of setting specs is a river herring and shad cap, and kind of concern on one hand about at very low river herring and shad caps, can we effectively monitor it versus if it doesn't change and is relatively high relative to the quota, does it erode the incentive for the fleet to avoid river herring and shad? AP input generally monitored public input, kind of a wide range in terms of the recommended rebuilding options, similar range of concerns about the river herring and shad cap. We also got some comments. So we didn't get many technical comments on the mesh issue in public comments, but from the AP, definitely got some input that it seemed like the mesh issue was not ripe from their perspective, just not knowing who's using what right now. We have very limited information on impacts on catchability from changes in mesh for mackerel. So with the committee kind of worked through a decision sequence. Two of them were combined basically into one motion. So there are 8 motions that will roll through from the committee today. I'll just flag that the quota outcome is interlinked with multiple decisions. How much is taken out for Canada? What's the starting ABC, et cetera. So if the council diverges from the committee, you may have to just give me a minute or two to recalculate kind of what the fallout is in terms of the final quota. But I can do that on the fly, but it'll just take a minute or two if the council heads in a different direction. So the motions are pretty specific. So before jumping to the motions and kind of before taking questions, so it'd be useful to kind of, big picture, what's the outcome of the committee motion? The committee recommended alternative 4. It's a 61% rebuilding. Starts with 2023 ABC of about 8,000 metric tons. Sets aside about 2,200 for Canada. That leaves about 5,900 metric tons for the U.S. You take out, committee recommended a 20 fish recreational possession limit, and deducting for recreational catch kind of what the paper calculation of that 20 fish possession limit would be. It's a 17% reduction from recent catch. 3-year average, recent average for discards, 115 metric tons, not a lot of mackerel discards. And that comes down to, that would come down to a 2023 commercial quota of 3,639 metric tons, also known as domestic annual harvest, the DAH, or the commercial quota. There's also a motion in there kind of recommending a slightly modified closure approach. It's basically a stepped closure, trying to balance some regulatory simplicity with not substantially being likely to overachieve or underachieve the quota. It's definitely going to have to be an adaptive approach, examine how that performs. It's based on recent history. It should be in the ballpark, but we'll have to see how it performs as kind of a at these low quota levels. The committee also recommended 129 metric ton river herring and shad cap. No action on the mesh requirement, and additional outreach on permitting and reporting with some clarification of who that would apply to. We have the committee motions lined up to work through, but can pause now for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Any questions for Jason?
I'll Also want to note there were some supplemental comments that came in, and there may be late comments if they came in through the standard protocol through the website. Thanks.
Must have done an excellent job, Jason. There's no questions currently. Let's start going through the motions, and we're going to have Peter Hughes read them on behalf of the committee. Let's start. We'll go by them one. We'll go through them one by one.
Morning, Mr. Chair. Good morning, fellow council members. Thank you, Jason, for the presentation. The first motion that came out of the committee is that I move that 2,197 metric tons be set aside for Canada for 2023. This motion passed committee through unanimous consent, and I can certainly read some rationale into the record if you'd like. So the rationale coming from the committee was that uncertainty does exist, but the 2,197 metric ton appears likely to approximate the 2023 Canadian landings considered the 2022 closure in Canada. So that's the rationale that goes with it. And like I said, this was passed through unanimous consent by the committee.
Thank you, Peter. Any questions for Peter or Jason? Seeing none, as this is the motion, are there any objections to the motion? Jason?
Not an objection, but just were you plan on kind of touching base for public comment on motions either in the room or webinar as we go? Just clarifying what you want, how you want to go with that.
Yes, any questions? I'll go to committee, or I'll go to council members first, and then I'll go to the audience if I see any questions. Are there any abstentions? We have one question. James Fletcher, do you still want to speak?
I'm concerned that you took fish out for Canada, but NAFO landings off of our EEZ are not taken in, and these landings have not been landed in the last 10 years. So why are we continuing not to include the fish that are outside the EEZ, and why can't that Bigelow do surveys beyond 200 to 300 fathoms? We're not getting science. Thank you.
Jason?
So the Canadian catches go into the our assessment. The U.S. assessment is a stock-wide assessment. So we're trying to account for all Western Atlantic mackerel catches. So since they go in, that's why they come out. As the science question, I defer to the center.
Mike?
Yeah, the ability for the agency to pay for the survey for the entire EEZ from North Carolina North taps us out. An ability to do in the outside the EEZ isn't something we have the resources for. We're struggling to make sure we get the resources to do the survey in-house. I mean, within our waters. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. James, do you have another question, or is your hand just up?
I would like to know, he says they survey the EEZ, but they do not get deeper than 200 fathoms. They don't go offshore. And the mackerel don't know where they survey. So we're not surveying the total biomass within the US EEZ. Unless I am wrong, I do not believe they get anywhere near 200 miles offshore.
Is that correct? Mike?
Yeah, I'd have to get the confirmation on the limitations for the survey from the folks that run it. And they're not part of my group, so I'm not prepared to cover that.
Okay, thank you, Mike. We have a audience, Pam.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair, members of the council. Pam Lyons-Gorman with Wild Oceans. And this is a question. So in the briefing materials under the supplementary comments, there is a letter from Canada, asking for, partnership with United States and measures that are complementary to their own. And as you know, they closed their directed fishery. So I'm wondering, based on that letter, it seems to indicate there's no plan to possibly reopen that fishery, and perhaps this number that we're considering is a bit too high. I'm just curious if there's been any additional dialogue with Canada about what their intent is for next year. Thank you.
Jason?
So they'll have a new assessment next year that they'll base their quota off on. So it's, so we don't know, what the results of that assessment are. They could, well, keep it closed, in which case we will have specified too much, or they could have some directed fishery, in which case we'd specified too little. If we've specified too much, then that 2,000 metric tons of fish just stay in the water, because we've set it aside. The way our fishery operates and our regulatory process operates, like this year when they closed, there really isn't time to try to go capture their late-breaking decision. So if they do keep it closed, then that fish just stays in the water. But again, from my kind of historic perspective, and we have had dialogue with Canada on this issue. They reiterate they will react to their assessment, but I haven't run across anything that suggests this is an unreasonable number that's likely within some range that they may set it at.
Thank you, Jason. Seeing no further questions, we'll go back to the motion again. Are there any objections to the motions? Any abstentions to the motion? The motion passes by unanimous consent. Peter, let's go with the next motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You can scroll up. Perfect. This committee motion, I move to select as preferred alternative 4, 61% rebuilding probability in 10 years. This motion again passed 9-0-0 at the committee. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Peter, you want to give some rationale?
Yeah, this approach balances the practicalities of landings and discards in U.S. fisheries with a high probability of rebuilding, in recognition that Atlantic mackerel play an important role in the ocean food web. The SSC deemed it a suitable rebuilding approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Any questions for Jason or Peter? Chris Savage.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Peter, I think the rationale for alternative 4 answered my question, but I was just curious to know about any of the discussions that the committee had on the option that's kind of between alternatives 3 and 4 that had a catch of 6,316 metric tons in 2023 and 2024, followed by the P-Star catches afterwards. Was it just that wasn't going to be enough for everyone's needs? Anyways, just wanted to get a little more clarification on that. Thanks.
Peter?
So, Chris, I believe you're referring to alternative 3.5. That was a new alternative that was presented to the committee. There was discussion around that, and maybe I'll have to ask Jason to fill in some blank spots, but it was decided that alternative 4 was a better fit for the committee, and based on the 9-0 vote, that would seem to be the case, and alternative 3.5 ultimately failed at the committee level. Chris. Jason, if you want to fill in any other points, please feel free.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. Again, there are other committee members who are here who could potentially speak to it, but yeah, I don't have anything else to add.
Dr. Michelle Duvall?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, I was, as indicated in the briefing materials, I was the one who asked Jason about this. There just seemed to be kind of a lot of real estate between alternative 3, the P-Star approach, and alternative 4, which the committee ultimately approved. The rationale that I was looking at was, trying to, by having catches for, at least 2023 with this type of approach, and potentially 2024, to just boost rebuilding a little bit in that early time frame. So it, knowing that we are going to be getting multiple management track assessments coming down the road, those future ABCs are likely to change from what we see here in the draft public hearing document. So that was the rationale. The committee had a good amount of discussion about that. Ultimately that was a substitute motion. It ultimately failed. And so, the original committee motion for the 61% rebuilding probability approach passed, and everyone was, I think, satisfied with that approach.
Thank you, Michelle. Any more questions? Percy?
Hey everyone, thank you, council and committee, for all your consideration, and Jason, unbelievably hard work. Thank you. I want to direct everyone's attention to our letter in the briefing book. It was submitted for the supplemental briefing material, but I wanted to make sure that the council considered the fact that this alternative calculates an ABC that exceeds the recommendation of the SSC. I've heard from council, I brought this up at the committee meeting, and council for NOAA said that the SSC had, without actually explicitly saying so, endorsed all alternatives as consistent with the best available science. But the Magnuson-Stevens Act requires you guys to follow the recommendation of the SSC for purposes of what an ABC should be set at, regardless of whether or not all alternatives are consistent with the best available science. I would assume that every alternative included in a rebuilding plan is consistent with the best available science. But ultimately, once the SSC formalizes a recommendation under Magnuson, the council is beholden to select an ABC that is less than the ABC that is preferred or that is recommended by the SSC. Looking at kind of the SSC notes from that meeting and listening to the SSC meeting, their rationale for choosing that alternative was because P-Star, when calculated for this rebuilding plan, ultimately prevents the risk of overfishing by up to 85%, which is something, and the P-Star approach has not been followed by this council in any of the rebuilding plans since the P-Star has been put into place. And, you know, it's in place for a reason. It's in place to prevent exactly what happened in Mackerel building version 1, which was that in every single year of the rebuilding plan, overfishing was still happening. And the SSC clearly outlines why they think the council should be following a P-STAR risk policy approach. They explain the level of risk. And if you go back to that slide that Jason had up there originally with the graph of the trajectories, you know, the span, the margin of error for all of these alternatives is considerable. Yes, does the median actually go over in 10 years? Sure. Does that median have a 60% chance of going over in 10 years? Sure. But the margin for error in all of the in alternatives 2 through 5 is considerable. And, you know, so I think that the council needs to think really hard about why the SSC is recommending what they're recommending with their P-STAR approach for alternative 3. It was alternative 2 in the document that the SSC looked at, but it's now alternative 3. And consider their obligation under Magnuson to stay within it.
Jason, do you have a comment?
And NOAA GC may be most appropriate to weigh in on this, but from staff's perspective, you know, the council has to stick to the ABC recommendations of the SSC. That was the direct request related to term of reference 1. They identified the ABC recommendations for each rebuilding option. And the council would be sticking with the ABC associated with the rebuilding option that it's selecting. The kind of recommendation for P-STAR was made under TOR 2, this kind of guidance regarding the relative risks associated with the different rebuilding alternatives. I would agree that careful consideration of their rationale is warranted. But as far as I'm aware, there's no kind of legal conflict here with the council, being the risk decider in terms of selecting a rebuilding approach. But again, GC may have further thoughts.
John Almeida.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I'd agree with what Jason just said. The terms of reference to the SSC were to come up with ABC recommendations for the alternatives, the alternative rebuilding plans, and to provide guidance on, the various alternatives and approaches. That's, a policy call for the council to make, but to translate that into those recommendations, therefore render all the other ABC recommendations invalid, I don't see how we get there from a legal perspective. I mean, I think terms of reference 2 was to give the council the SSC's perspective on these things, and that's which one the council chooses. I mean, presuming that it stays within the sidebars of the law, that's a policy call for the council to make. Thanks.
Percy, you have a follow-up?
Yes, sorry. It was taking me a second to unmute. I was unraising my hand instead. So 2 things in relation to that. First, yes, it's a policy call for the council to make, but NOAA can't approve something that's in violation of the Magnuson-Stevens Act. So ultimately, it's possible that you will be sending something to NOAA that they can't approve if you authorize something that exceeds the SSC recommendation. And as council just said, the SSC recommendation, first off, if you plug in whatever your rebuilding plan is into the recruitment predictions, ABCs are generated by the alternative that you select. So there's only so much wiggle room within that alternative once you've plugged in the recruitment information that you're going to use in order to find the rebuilding trajectory. So the ABCs are sort of generated by the alternative that you select. It's not like you can say, well, we're going to pick this particular trajectory and then pick an ABC that has nothing to do with it. The ABCs are generated by the alternative that you select first. Second, if you go back and you look at the SSC's letter to Mike Luisi and to the council, they circle alternative 2 and it's in a graph, and I mean in a table, and in that table they outline what ABCs are for 2023 and 2024. So when they say we're selecting this alternative, the P-star at MSY approach, they circle the alternative that includes the ABCs for 2023 and 2024. So when I look at that as a lawyer, my legal interpretation of that is that the SSC is giving you guys a recommendation for the ABCs for 2023, and that those ABCs are connected to the rebuilding alternative that generates them. So I think it's really hard to slice and dice it the way General Counsel is looking at it, because I don't think it's ultimately slice and diceable the way he's slicing it. I think that once you pick a trajectory, it generates your ABCs, and not only that, but the SSC has given you a number, and that is circled in their recommendation letter to Chairman Luisi.
All right, thank you, Percy. Peter Hughes?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Upon reading the summary of the latest Squid Mackerel Butterfish Committee meeting, that we have to remember that this is a 1-year setting only for 2023. This is because there's going to be a management track assessment expected in 2023 using data through 2022. So we're only setting this as a 1-year basically measure, because we're going to be revisiting not the suite of alternatives that are before us today, but we're going to be revisiting this alternative in the future in 2023 for 2024 and possibly beyond, based on what we get out of that management track assessment. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Michelle Duval?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I appreciate the points that Percy is raising. Rebuilding of mackerel it's a very important issue. But the SSC is very explicit when it provides ABC recommendations to the council. And I think if you read through other sections of that report where the SSC is providing ABC recommendations for other species, it is noted as the SSC recommends, the following ABC. I mean, it's very explicit in the language of those. So, I mean, when I read the SSC report, the SSC was recommending an approach. They were, providing their assessment of risk under term of reference 2. There were, multiple rebuilding strategies that we could choose from. Ultimately, alternative 4 is what was approved by the committee. I again appreciate what Percy's bringing up, but I think if you read the rest of that SSC report, you can see where the SSC is extremely explicit when it is recommending ABCs for other species. Thank you.
Jason?
Just a follow-up to Peter's comment. It's kind of just an interesting consequence of the new assessment approach. So when we get a new management track assessment for mackerel or many of other species, the reference points themselves get updated with every management track, which means every time we get one of those, our target changes a bit. And this management track assessment includes really no years, the 2021, when the first rebuilding plan was in place. Right? It went at the end of November 2019, so I don't think it's fair to count 2019. It's really, that was the last year that went into this management track. So we get it kind of in an interesting cycle of having to do, kind of a revised rebuilding approach before even knowing how the first plan was working. Now, in this case, I think it's actually really good, because before we started, we figure out we were probably kind of off a good bit, and we need to adjust to that. But it is kind of an interesting cycle where we have to react before we see the results of one rebuilding plan, and our goalposts change because a management track assessment with a standard assessment is going to update the reference points. So I think it's good and adaptive, but it definitely complicates things. That again, when we get that next management track assessment in 2023, the goalposts may well change yet again. They may change a little bit. It could change a lot, probably not a ton, but it's kind of a complicated cycle that it's adaptive and we have to react to new information. But it's become an interesting process.
Thank you, Jason. Pam?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair, members of the council. Pam Lyons-Gorman with Wild Oceans. And I just wanted to highlight something that Percy brought up, and that's the council's risk policy. It's a good risk policy. When a stock's in trouble, we take a very low risk of overfishing, and mackerel's been overfished. Overfishing's been occurring for 30 years. Now's the time we really have to buckle down if we want this stock to recover. And once again, the stock is in trouble, it's overfished, and we're departing from our council risk policy. Is this a risk policy that the council believes in, or is it not? I think that's a really important discussion to have, because it seems like when it gets a difficult decision to make, we veer off into a different direction. I am opposed to alternative 4. Part of the rationale supporting it was, mackerel's importance in the food web. If we're concerned about mackerel's role in the food web, we're going to leave more fish in the water. And alternative 3, the one that your scientific and statistical committee experts in ecology recommended, leaves more fish in the water. Alternative 4 is actually a level that's twice as much as alternative 3. So I wish we could revisit alternative 3. I think it's the better way to go. And I think it's actually more practicable, because I believe that the Canadian component of that is still, again, too high. Canada has asked us for partnership and complementary action, and alternative 3 in our analysis best fits with the way Canada is headed to try to conserve the stock and revive it. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Pam. Zachary Greenberg?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Zach Greenberg with the Pew Charitable Trust. Just a few comments quickly here, and we cannot support alternative 4. The council and staff have our comment letter where we supported alternative 1 for many of the reasons that have been stated here. Most importantly, the ecological role of Atlantic mackerel. And the fact that Atlantic mackerel are overfished and subject to overfishing and have been for nearly 4 decades now. But I guess I wanted to ask a question in this comment. I'm having a little trouble squaring what I'm reading in the SSC report that I'm just going to read it verbatim, but the SSC reviewed all alternatives and recommends the P-star approach with the maximum fishing mortality threshold equal to FMSY proxy, or alternative 2 at the time, which I believe is now alternative 3 in the public hearing document and what was considered by the committee. So I guess I'm just, Jason, looking for a little clarification, and I do just want to note, I just want to thank Jason for his efforts here. The time the committee and the AP has spent on this issue as well. It's complex, it's ever changing, and I just want to reiterate that it's really important to get this right, and the council really needs to embrace this opportunity, certainly as we got a second crack at it with a revised rebuilding plan here. Thank you.
Megan Lapp?
And there was a question in that comment. I can respond a bit.
Thanks, Jason.
Yep. Again, I think from staff's perspective, TR1 was direct to the ABCs. The SSC recommended ABCs for each alternative, and they, contingent upon the rebuilding alternative selection, the council could not exceed those ABCs. the recommendation was kind of the focus of discussion in terms of reference to, which is guidance regarding the relative risks associated with the different rebuilding alternatives, not an ABC specific discussion that is typically binding. And I think the kind of the kind of flip side of that interpretation would be, well, in the future, the council could just ask the ABCs associated with different rebuilding options and not ask for any input regarding the relative risks, which I don't think would be, a useful approach. So again, it seems like, there's two different TORs here, and the SSC responded accordingly, and then the council's using that information accordingly. Thanks.
Megan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Megan Lapp, Fisheries. We support the motion. The committee had a good discussion on this issue, and this is going to be an iterative process as we move forward, because we're going to have management track updates, which means we're going to have updates to this rebuilding plan over the next 10 years anyways. So we support the motion. Thank you.
Eric Reed?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. So I'll make it as brief as possible. I agree with the comments of Mr. Almeida as far as where we are on legal ground here. I don't see any problem with where we are. That's the first thing. Second thing is the AP actually, although I'm pretty sure it wasn't a unanimous vote, they preferred alternative 5. And the committee was more conservative than the AP in picking alternative 4, which at 61% is above 50%, which the SSC said anything over 50% is more likely to succeed. That's what the SSC said. As far as the comments about Canada being a partner, from where I sit in New England, I can tell you for sure that if you look at other species that we have engagement with Canada on, they're not always the best partner in the world. And there's a long history behind that, but I'll do this. That's my comment. That's my personal opinion, but I think it's reasonably based in fact. And, we can talk about Magnuson Act all you want, but the one thing we haven't heard is National Standard 8. What's the effect on the communities, which has to be considered in any action we do? At this point, the ABC is going to be low. Commercial sector is going to suffer pretty heavily at the levels that we'll actually end up with attack for that sector. Jason said it's like a light switch. I mean, to me, it's a dimmer switch, and I'll tell you what, the bulb's not all that bright for us in the commercial fishing industry. So this is in line with National Standard 8 because it considers the effect on the communities. If we rebuild the stock and nobody's left to go get it, what happened? So that's where I'm at. Alternative 4 meets all the goals, and hopefully the council will move this forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Adam Nowalski?
We're at a bit of an impasse here with some interpretations from the public, with those of some council members and Garfo legal counsel. I'm wondering if Dr. Rago is willing to weigh in on what he believes the intent of the SSC report was. Was it that all of the ABCs could be recommended and allowable, and that they just gravitated toward what was option 2 at the time based on the risks, but they weren't explicitly changing the ABC recommendation that came out of TOR 1?
Yeah, this is Paul. Thank you. Thank you, Adam, and thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the SSC report should stand as is in terms of our interpretation. As noted, all of the trajectories do meet the standards in terms of achieving the probability of rebuilding and avoiding overfishing during that trajectory. So I think that's kind of a first statement. The second would be that there are some considerable number of advantages, as Jason outlined and as noted in the report. These alternative trajectories really can't be mixed and matched to any great extent. So embarking on, say, the 60% rebuild probability under the assumptions which it's structured, it would mean if you go to a P-star approach in a later year, you would be paying back that, say, taking 8,094 metric tons versus the 4,539 under the P-star approach. That consequence is paid back in the next set. So you may not necessarily gain the longer term benefits associated with the higher immediate yields. So each one of those alternatives really selects a trajectory, a full set of expected catches over the rebuilding period. So I hope that's useful, and happy to try to clarify further if appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rego. Greg?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, council members. Just brief comments. Lund's Fisheries, Greg DiDomenico. We support Alternative 4 for many of the same reasons you've heard, not only from the deliberative process that produced that alternative, but we also rely heavily on staff advice, and we rely heavily upon committee discussion, which also passed this motion unanimously. So I don't want to take up too much time here, but I think it's also important to talk just a little history about this this fishery. It was not that long ago that American shoreside processors were urged to invest heavily in this fishery and Americanize this fishery and compete on a worldwide market. We did that. Seafreeze did it. Lund's did it. Several other companies did it. I know we're splitting hairs here on the actual amounts, but if this alternative allows one or two more people to survive until this fishery comes back, then I think it's important to kind of note that you'd be giving some acknowledgement to the investment that's already there shoreside and in those vessels. So for those reasons, we support Alternative 4. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. All right, we are going to see if we can pass this by consent. If not, we will do a vote. Are there any objections to the motion? No objections. Are there any abstentions? Seeing none, the vote passed by unanimous consent. Peter, our next motion.
Thanks. Just need the screen to scroll up. This motion is in regards to the recreational measures. This is a committee motion. I move to select as preferred a 20 fish per person Atlantic mackerel recreational possession limit for 2023 and could be adjusted in future specifications. I can give you some rationale if you'd like. You know, this reduces recreational mortality to further support ongoing rebuilding. While smaller limits may achieve greater reductions on paper, they cause severe economic impacts that would ripple through tuna and other fisheries as a result of a drastic possession limit change from the current unlimited. They are not practicable from a compliance and enforcement side, and the costs likely outweigh the benefits. A 20 fish limit benefits from buy-in of the regulated community and is a meaningful first step for 2023. Additionally, this limit likely will improve the reliability of MRIP catch estimates and is consistent with the Canadian limit. This motion passed through unanimous consent. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Any questions on the motion? Chris Batsavage.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, question and maybe a couple of comments. The part of the rationale where it says this limit will likely improve the reliability of MRIP catch estimates, is that compared to no bag limit at all, meaning that you just kind of less of a a spread in potential catches, and that should improve the precision of the harvest estimates. Am I interpreting that right?
Yeah, I think it was just if people are adhering to the bag limits, it's going to reduce some outliers, which definitely are in there. You see a few records of 100 fish, 150 fish, 200 fish that, again, can have the potential to, depending on where they occur, to create some outlier issues.
Okay, thanks. I guess a couple just general comments. I mean, obviously, there's no recreational Atlantic mackerel fishery in North Carolina, but plenty of other recreational fisheries. Yeah, I know putting in management measures on a fishery that with little or no regulations in the past is difficult, but just our experience is kind of the results of those management measures tend to be mixed. In other words, you don't always get what you expect, especially if the popularity and availability of that fish is still high. So the 20 fish bag limit kind of concerns me in that respect, as far as whether or not it's actually going to drop the recreational catch to the level that's expected. And although it's consistent with the Canadian limit, and although Canada doesn't have catch estimates for the recreational fishery, I guess it's a little tough to compare. We're just looking at the population of Atlantic Canada. It's much less than northern New England. I'm pretty sure the fishing effort isn't quite as high up there either, just with the smaller population and less infrastructure for the recreational fishery. So with that, I don't think I can support this motion. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. Any further questions before we call the motion to a vote? Mike Wayne?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mike Wayne, sorry. Mike Wayne with the American Sport Fishing Association. I have a question about the future adjustments and specifications part of this motion. During this process, we saw a lot of engagement from the recreational fishing community on this proposed bag limit for this fishery. There will clearly be economic impacts to this action. And so I'm just curious, what will the process be for potentially adjusting this through future specifications, and how will that process ensure that the rec community has ample opportunity to participate in any potential changes?
Jason?
So, I mean, I think the concern is sometimes our specifications are rolling quickly without a lot of attention. The council could, establish, any outreach that it deemed appropriate for this. I think the commenter is suggesting that something more than the typical specs process outreach may be appropriate, but that's up to the council.
Can I follow up?
Bentley.
Yeah, I mean, I guess considering this is new, I'm just thinking about the specification process that we have for some of our other recreationally important species. I think it would be important for the council to highlight in this fishery how the industry can play a role in any potential changes here. Jason can tell you there was a lot of participation on the hearings regarding this action. And I want to try to keep the industry engaged on this because it's really important as a bait for the bluefin tuna and striped bass fisheries. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, we're going to be doing this vote. Eric Reed?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. I think the motion should actually say as preferred at 20 fish per person per day. as a possession limit. That's what it came out of the committee.
Jason?
I think this is the motion that was passed. I know there have been discussions by the state folks that, they only have, they try to track who's catching what per day. Are they doing multiple day trips? That it seems simplest just to keep it at a flat possession limit because that's what the state would be enforcing.
Follow up, Eric.
No, I'm all set. That's fine.
All right, we were going to do this vote by a show of hands. Peter has read it already into the record. So all those in favor, please raise your hands on the computer, please. Looks like we have 18. Everybody put their hands down, please. All those opposed? 1. The motion passes 18-1. Any abstention, or there wouldn't be any abstentions unless Mike's not voting. No abstentions. All right, Peter, our next motion, please.
Just needed to scroll up a little bit. Okay, I move, sorry. This came out of committee that I move that the 2023 recreational deduction. Hang on, my screen just glitched. Expected deduction from the 20 fish possession limit. I'll read that again. I move that a 2023 recreational deduction be made using the calculated expected deduction from the 20 fish possession limit. That would minus 2,100 metric tons. This motion passed by consent with 1 abstention.
Would you like to give some rationale, please?
Don't have a whole lot associated, but it included potential arbitrariness in not accounting for potential recreational measures, and the recreational responses would lead to lesser or greater reductions than projected. Discussion also questioned whether an overall management uncertainty buffer was included in the rebuilding options. No. Whether one existed now, yes, for commercial, or whether they could be included in the future. And Jason, if you have anything else additional you'd like to add, please feel free to do so.
Yeah, I mean, the monitoring committee had a good bit of discussion on this, suggesting that, given it's going to be hard to know what the outcome of this new limit is. You could have some people just not take trips. You could have some people take an extra person with them to keep some extra fish. There's going to be, we're not going to know the angler response until we see it. So the monitoring committee had suggested just either leaving it at the 5-year average or only taking or splitting the difference. But I think the committee, kind of evaluated it and decided, is it best at this point just to take the calculated deduction. I think given the quantities involved here between the 5-year average, it's been fairly stable the last few years, and this deduction, it's not a substantial concern to me one way or the other. And again, the committee laid its rationale out for why it thought, this approach made sense at this time. And like many other aspects of this, will have to be kind of a live and learn approach. We see what the results are.
Thank you, Jason. Any questions for Jason or Peter? Seeing none, let's see if we can also pass this one by consent. Are there any objections to this motion? Seeing none. Any abstentions? None. The motion passes by unanimous consent. Peter, next motion, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Committee motion, I move that the council utilize the proposed replacement 2023 discard set aside and closure approach. This would be a U.S. commercial quota of 3,639 metric tons, and this motion passed but the committee through unanimous consent. Thank you.
Do we have any rationale for this?
I don't, but Jason, I don't have any summary of that.
Yeah, I mean, I can, the discards are fairly low, just a 3-year average per, I think the center staffer calculations, and the monitoring committee was content with that. Again, it's a relatively small amount. The closure approach, I think Garfo would maybe like a slightly more standardized approach in looking long term. But based on recent landings history, this seems like it will need with the stepped closures with some buffering depending on if it's before or after May 1. Seems like it should neither overshoot nor undershoot tremendously. Again, based on recent landings history. Like the rec side of things, it's going to have to be a live and learn approach. There is a hard backstop with a pretty low trip limit once it gets to, I think, within 100 metric tons of that quota. Again, it's designed to try to balance not creating a regulatory discard issue, still having some trip limits that may occur in some other fishery and can accommodate those with not overshooting the quota. The recommended approach from staff was as adopted by the committee with those kind of trade-offs and goals in mind.
Thank you, Jason. Any questions for Jason or Peter? Seeing none, let's see if we can pass this one by consent. Are there any objections to the motion? Any abstentions? The motion passes by unanimous consent. Peter, next one, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Committee motion. I move that the committee recommend that the council maintain the current 129 metric ton river herring and shad catch cap for 2023. I don't have any rationale in my summary here, but I do know that we had a pretty robust conversation about this. This motion passed by unanimous consent through the committee. Thank you.
Jason.
So again, I think the committee discussed the trade-off of if the cap gets very, very low, and if you scale it as we were scaling it a few years ago at these quota levels, you're down to, I think, a few dozen metric tons for the cap. Given the limited observer coverage, given until we get 5 observed trips in a year, we're blending from the previous year's data and the current year's data at a super, super low amount. It's just, very challenging to monitor. And again, you may be closing, quite likely will be closing this year based on the previous year's data. You won't have time for those new trips to feed in and be blended in. On the flip side, if you look at the ratio of the cap, the previous quotas, and the ratio of this cap to where the council is headed with this quota, the ratio is going to be higher because it's the same cap and a lower quota. So the flip side concern is, does it maintain the incentive for the fleet to avoid river herring and shad? Because the fleet is likely to be encountering river herring and shad a lot less just because it can't catch that much mackerel. But again, that's the discussion, that trade-off there of having something that's monitorable, considering the general impacts on the fleet from the lower quota, versus maintaining the incentive to avoid river herring and shad. And I think that's kind of how the discussion centered.
Peter?
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize that my mic was still on. There was also discussion about equity between fisheries in the herring fishery in comparison to the mackerel fishery, and the herring fishery will be fishing under a similar ABC. And their river herring shad allowances, tolerances are considerably different than what the mackerel river herring and shad is currently allowing for. Thank you.
Any questions for Peter or Jason? Michelle DeVoe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm going to be a little bit of a Grinch here, and I apologize for that because I know this was a unanimous committee motion, and I'm a member of the committee. You know, I had asked a question during our discussion about, you know, the service's ability to monitor an 89 metric ton river herring cap, which was, you know, an alternative that was put forward for additional consideration, or at least for staff examination, and determined to be within the range of alternatives that we'd taken out to public comment. And, you know, I maintain concern, you know, after considering this further, that, you know, we need to I think, be true to the scaling approach that Jason mentioned. So, you know, I'm going to make a substitute motion, and, you know, I'd like to move to substitute that the council adopt an 89 metric ton river herring and shad cap for 2023. So, you know, and if I can get a second to that, then I'll add some more rationale.
Sarah Winslow.
I'll second that motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I know it was provided in the information that we received during the committee that, you know, this level of a cap was, you know, associated when we were having 13,000 metric ton catches. So, you know, as a cap for 1 year, this would still provide, I think, some incentive for avoidance, but, you know, is not as restrictive as a cap that would be scaled to, you know, the current harvest levels that we'd be putting in place for 2023. So I feel like this is, you know, a decent compromise between trying to maintain the rationale for our current system of scaling, you know, the shad and river herring caps with our quotas for mackerel, but not implementing something that is, you know, just logistically impossible to track. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelle. Sarah, do you have anything else you'd like to offer?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. As Jason mentioned and Michelle did too, during the committee meeting, we did have discussion relative to this. And one of my main concerns and issues is that there's been a reduction essentially in an incentive to avoid capturing river herring. It is a challenge, of course, obtaining adequate observer coverage. We've lost the midwater trawl closure areas, so that bit of area in those hot spots is not protected. You're essentially dealing with 4 species of fish that are in trouble: blueback, alewife, American shad, and hickory shad collectively in this. There is a new assessment underway with MAFMC for river herring that's due next year. However, I can't imagine, based on the track record, that it's going to be showing any great improvements. You've got states that have worked hard trying to recover and restore spawning areas in their states, stocking that are occurring. Essentially, at this 129 metric tons of shad or river herring, a lot of them, based on the data Jason presented from years ago. A lot of these are immature fish that haven't even spawned. You're roughly looking at 1.1 million fish being removed. That essentially could wipe out the entire restoration of some states. But that's my comments relative to the proposed motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Any comments from the council? Pam, comment?
Thank you again, Mr. Vice Chair, members of the Mid-Atlantic Council, Pam Lyons-Grumman with Wild Oceans. I am very appreciative of this motion and fully support it. As someone who has been following shad and river herring and involved in shad and river herring conservation for some time, when I looked at the mackerel rebuilding document and the cap options, there really was not much to choose from. We had a scaling option, which the document pretty much tells you is not going to be practicable based on our very low levels of observer coverage and the extrapolations that would be necessary. The other option was just status quo, the 129 metric tons, which applies to a quota of over 17,000 metric tons. And you've already heard in the rationale, the quotas we're looking at now are so much lower than that the ratios of allowable river herring and shad to mackerel catch will get substantially higher. I've appreciated the Mid-Atlantic Council's approach to incentivize avoidance using the cap methodology. The 89 metric tons was grounded in the original document that created the bycatch cap measure. It is a baseline period. Still, again, it was applied to a higher quota in the past. We've used it, we've implemented it, so we know it's possible. It was a two-step cap at the time, but we even had a lower cap, actually, in history of 82 metric tons for a quota that was less than 10,000 metric tons. So it's doable, and it's a reasonable middle ground. And I'll just add that since we're here on the Peconic, I had a chance to kind of tour around and look at some of the fish ladder work that's been taking place in partnership with the state of New York and NOAA and the communities here. And it's amazing, the habitat that we are opening up, because impoundments certainly are kind of the #1 obstacle. But we have opened up more and more habitat. Every year we are taking down dams, improving fish passage. And yet, sadly, in touring these areas, the runs are they're not recovering yet. And as fishery managers, what can we do? We can control fishing mortality, and we can stay strong with the incentive to avoid. So anyway, I think this is a very reasonable middle ground between the two options that were provided for in the document. And I hope that you all support this substitute motion, or this, yes, substitute motion. Thank you so much.
Chris Pat Savage.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to go on record to say I support the substitute motion for all the reasons that have been given by Michelle, Pam, and Sarah. Thank you.
Dan Farnham.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chair. We did have a long discussion at the committee level on this, and I appreciate all the comments and the sub-motion. I just want to point out, this year especially, I really don't see a directed fishery for mackerel this year, with fuel pushing $6 a gallon. Right now, the Elex boats aren't even leaving the dock. They're afraid to. And with a very small commercial quota available to the mackerel fleet as it is, it'd be a real shame to not let them have access to it over a reduction in the river herring shad cap. Thank you.
Thank you. Percy?
Hey, everyone. Thanks for letting me comment again. Probably tired of hearing from me at this point, but I'd like to support the motion to substitute for all the reasons that Michelle and Sarah and Pam have stated. I also wanted to just bring everyone's attention back to what Pam said about the cap at 32 that we put in for any mackerel quota that was under 10,000 metric tons. I believe that was in 2018 that we did that. But you know, the purpose for all of that, as stated by the council, as stated by the River Herring and Shad Committee, was to make sure that there's an incentivized avoidance. And with the options that were laid out in the document, the 129 metric tons does not do that. A scalable cap would be preferred, but this seems to be like a great compromise between those two options. And I support the motion, and I hope the council votes it in. Thanks.
Eric Reed.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. I mean, honestly, we're having the wrong conversation, in my mind. The way that the catch is actually calculated is problematic for me. It's really complicated. There's double counting between mackerel and herring fisheries, and what we really need to do, and we talked about this at the Yotel, I believe, but we decided not to do it, is to look at the way that the percentage is calculated, how these interactions are calculated, because to me that's the biggest problem, and that may solve all of our concerns to get that right. But that's a relatively complicated conversation. I have to disagree with Chairperson Winslow that it is not 4 species, it's probably 6 or maybe 7, because mackerel and herring are both in trouble, and Mr. Farnham is correct. The actual effort on those 2 commercial species is going to be very low for a lot of reasons. One is you can't catch them. 2, you can't afford to go fishing for them. And that would make the 7th species the fishermen themselves. So at 129, it's easier to calculate that and keep track of it. You know, we're having a hard enough time keeping track of things on a day-to-day basis now, and I don't want to impose further restrictions on the commercial fishery by going to 89 as opposed to 129. So that's where I'm at. It's really the methodology that's a problem for all of us. You know, we're using trips from a prior year, a full year, to calculate what the discards are now. And that's not right. And it is a very complicated, it's hard to understand. I mean, I've looked at it 1,000 times and I'm not sure if I can figure it out. So to me, that's what we should be focusing on. Keep the 129 for a year, and let's look at where we really should be going with this cap. Thank you.
Jeff Kalen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Jeff Kalen with Lunds Fisheries. Good morning, Council. This is just, I'm strongly opposed this motion, particularly after all the time we spent on this, to stay at the 129. Looking at the information from the New England Council about their decision to not scale the river herring caps with the very rapidly declining fishery up there. I think collectively in the mackerel and the herring fishery in the entire region, we only have about 10,000 metric tons, which is 10% of what we had on the herring. So, you know, one of the things that I had my hand up earlier, Mr. Chairman, I'm not being critical certainly, but earlier in the discussion about which one of the rebuilding options the council was going to choose, and I appreciate your vote. But one of the things in the SSC report that was focused on during that discussion that wasn't mentioned is, you know, the SSC suggested that further investigation into potential environmental drivers for recent low improvement be done. What's happening to these pelagic fish? I mean, it's very easy for people to sit back and say, well, you know, we've had this decline over time. If only we could get to the fishermen and, you know, stop the fishing mortality damage, you know, we'll be fine. There'll be plenty of fish in the water for forage, whatever, you know, whatever the campaign of the moment happens to be. This is another one. This does not, there's a couple of important things that this approach does not reflect, and that is the data that we have. We saw it Jason gave it to us at the AP meeting and the committee meeting, that the offshore stocks of alewife and blueback are actually doing very well. And that this isn't being taken into account. So, we won't want to catch these fish, but avoiding them with an increasing ocean population and penalizing a fishery that's now down to 4,000 metric tons. When we started, it was 300,000 metric tons, right? So, like Greg said, these investments were made. We're trying to hang on. This is a bycatch fishery now. And this is just another cut, and there's no justification for it. It's just like taking a dart and throwing it against the wallboard, And so what we suggested at the committee meeting was that the 129 be looked at maybe as a cap on mortality from the offshore fishing fleet, which barely exists any longer, when the commission takes a look at assessing river herring. But this motion is just a spanking, and I'm totally opposed to it, particularly after coming out with unanimous agreement, at the committee. I hope that this gets voted down, and thank you for letting me make the comments.
Chris Pat Savage.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Question for Jason. Jason, what was the estimated river herring and shad catch in the mackerel fishery the last couple of years? I know we heard about the overages that occurred, I think in 18 and 19. But I was curious what we've seen in the in the last couple of years. Thanks.
I'm just going to look at Garfo's handy dandy quarter monitoring site to make sure I don't misspeak. River herring and shad. Okay, just focusing on the mackerel. Okay, 2022, there's almost no mackerel catch, so not much there. So 2021, it was 3 metric tons. 2020, 23 metric tons, and then 2019 were the 2 years of the closure, so it was 91 in 2019, and I'll just do last one. 2018 was 109 metric tons. That's it.
Is that what you needed, Chris?
Yes, thank you.
Zachary Greenberg.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Zach Greenberg with the Pew Charitable Trust. Just wanted to state our support of the substitute motion. So while we supported scaling of the cap in our comment letter, we strongly support an 89 metric ton cap for 2023. I truly appreciate the efforts of the maker of the motion and the supporting comments made by the seconder. Goes without saying, river herring and shad remain at or near historic lows coastwide. States are heavily investing in the removal of impoundments and other habitat improvements. The point of the cap is to incentivize avoidance, and right now the cap is the only remaining incentive to avoid river herring and shad in federal waters. So again, just want to state our strong support for the 89 metric ton substitute motion here. We feel it's justified for 2023. Thank you.
Peter Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Mackerel Squid Butterfish Committee is an excellent committee, and I just want them to know that I will be supporting the underlying motion and will not be supporting this motion to substitute, as the underlying motion passed by unanimous consent, and there are 9 members on that committee who are sitting around this table here today, who are with us today, either at the table or on the phone. We're on that committee, and we had a considerable amount of deliberations on this topic, and I will be supporting the committee and their recommendations going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Megan, make it short, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Megan Lapp, Seafreeze. A lot of comparisons have been made to the herring fishery, and I know that folks around the table may not be familiar with the herring fishery, so I just kind of want to fill in some of the blanks. I am the chair of the New England Council's Herring Advisory Panel. The first point is that none of the river herring and shad caps are biomass based. None of these numbers have any basis in the river herring and shad biomass. They don't scale up or down with biomass or anything like that. It's purely a math problem. When New England lowered the herring quotas substantially, they kept the caps the same. But for comparison, I'd like folks to know that the way that the river herring and shad caps are set, they're exponentially higher than anything that we have in the Mid-Atlantic for mackerel. For mackerel, currently the cap is 129 metric tons for the entire coast, okay, Maine to North Carolina. For the herring, river herring and shad catch caps, it's split up by both gear and area. So the southern New England midwater trawl herring cap, river herring cap, is 129 metric tons on its own. Then the southern New England bottom trawl catch cap for river herring is 122 metric tons on its own. And then the Gulf of Maine and Cape Cod midwater trawl catch caps are they're over 100 metric tons on their own combined. So when you're talking 129 metric tons for the whole coast, for both midwater trawl and small mesh bottom trawl, you're talking something that's very, very small and very hard to mathematically analyze. And like it was brought up earlier, you know, in the past few years, we have closed with the mackerel catch cap. And the problem that we're going to have going forward with low mackerel quotas is that because there's lower quotas, there's going to be fewer trips and therefore fewer observed trips. So what happens is if you have, say, a fishery closure due to hitting the cap in this year, the catch rates from this year are extrapolated and carried out into next year at the beginning of next year before you have any observed trips. So you could actually start out with a closed fishery. So the lower numbers make the math problem very, very problematic. And that is going to be exacerbated by fewer mackerel trips due to lower quotas. So that being said, I don't support the substitute motion. I support the underlying motion for these reasons. And like I said, it's not biomass based, it's a math problem based. And the lower numbers make the math problem very complicated. Thank you.
Thank you. We are now going to vote on the substitute motion. Michelle has already read it into the record. If you are in favor of the substitute motion, please raise your hand. I have 8 in favor. Please put your hands down. All those opposed, please put your hand up. I have 10 opposed. Any abstentions? Everybody put your hands down first. And any abstentions? 1. Motion fails 8-10 to 1. The main motion is now, or the previous motion is back to our main motion again. I move that the committee to recommend that the council maintain the current 129 metric ton river herring and shad cap for 2023. Peter Hughes has made this motion for the committee. All those in favor, please raise your hands. I got 16 in favor. Everybody, please lower your hands. All those opposed, please raise your hand. I have one opposed. Any abstentions? Chris, I'm sorry, lower your hand. Abstentions? One abstention. The main motion now passes 16-1-1. Peter, are you ready for our next motion?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Committee motion, I move that the council select as preferred no action on the commercial minimum mesh size. This was a vote that came out of committee by consent with one, hang on a second. Yes, with one abstention. And the rationale for this is, and Jason kind of touched on it during his presentation, not ripe for action given the lack of information to inform costs and benefits of adopting. We had limited to no public feedback on this action, and this speaks to a possible lack of effective engagement on the proposal. So that's the rationale, and I will say during the public hearings, we've heard very little on this, so we're not really sure that people were focused on this. So plus we don't know what the cost benefits are and what the economics are of it. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Peter. Any questions for Peter or Jason? Seeing none, we have a motion now. Are there any objections to the motion? Any abstentions on the motion? Seeing none, the motion passed by unanimous consent. And Peter, are you ready for our next motion as soon as we get it up?
I am. I was just pre-reading it a little bit. This committee motion, I move that the council request additional outreach and compliance assistance by NOAA Fisheries regarding the appropriate permitting and catch reporting for commercial and for-hire vessels possessing mackerel, parentheses, would apply only to commercial and for-hire vessels and would not include previously purchased fish with a bill of sale, close parenthesis, period. This motion passed by the committee through unanimous consent. And I don't have a whole lot of rationale here, but there's a lot of confusion. So, you know, it was recommended that some of these, some of the reporting requirements are unclear. Some of the actions that we're taking here today are completely new actions, such as the recreational possession limit that people have never had to report fish in the past. But recreational can also, if they choose to, they can switch to a different permit category, which would allow them actually additional fish, but there are reporting requirements that are associated with that. And there was a lack of understanding as to what those reporting requirements might be. And that's how I seem to recall those going, Jason, and please feel free to add anything.
And I think it speaks to a larger confusion about what reporting requirements are once people pick up a federal permit, especially on the for-hire side. You know, technically, once you pick up any of the GARFO for-hire permits, you're supposed to report all your fish on every trip, regardless of the species, including if you take a private trip on the vessel associated with that permit. That's not widely understood. So again, you know, I think general outreach on this topic would be good, but especially related to mackerel because of some additional confusion in the regs. And I think the committee worked through this motion to speak to that and hopefully create some improvements.
Any questions for Jason or Peter? Seeing Mike Bentley?
Thanks, Chair. So I guess I have a question because there's a little bit of mix and match here in this motion. There's the first part is addressing the permitting and cash reporting requirements, which seem clear in the intent of the motion that those permitting and cash reporting requirements would only apply to commercial vessels as they do now and for-hire vessels as they do now. Where I get a little confused is the parenthetical seems to be touching on the 20 fish possession limit, right? At least that's the way I'm interpreting it. So it seems to be mixing and matching a little bit who the 20 fish possession limit and how and when the 20 fish possession limit applies. And that's what I guess I'm looking for clarification on.
Yeah, I think that there was discussion of, what happens if, someone has purchased a couple flats of mackerel to chunk or chum, does that trigger the permitting requirement? And I think this parenthetical was to indicate that no, if there's a for-hire vessel that's, doesn't have a mackerel permit otherwise because it's not intending to catch mackerel, squid or butterfish, that, if they want to buy a few flats of mackerel to bring out for bait, it's not going to trigger the permitting requirement. So is, a clarification on that. And it is interlinked with that 20 fish limit, because if that's doesn't apply, then theoretically there's, just that 20 fish possession limit might apply. So the discussion at the committee was this kind of context would, provide the necessary direction that's going to have to be worked through a bit, as Garfield goes out, both in terms of rules related to this action and outreach.
So if I could just follow up just to make sure that everyone around the table understands my interpretation of this so that we're all clear. The 20 fish possession limit that we voted on earlier applies to anybody catching mackerel, whether it's a for-hire vessel or a private angler. If for hire, they should have a permit. If they're a private angler, they do not need a permit. The reporting requirements apply if you're a permitted for hire or commercial vessel, but not if you're a private angler. And the 20 fish possession limit applies if you're catching mackerel, but does not apply if you've got a couple of boxes of frozen mackerel that you bought at the bait shop.
Yes, and would apply, like, so we have this circumstance where folks will catch mackerel and store them in a live pen, maybe 100 in some areas at their dock. I think the states are liable to work out some implementation things to deal with that circumstance. But if they were bringing those live fish out that they had previously captured and been storing at a dockside, and they've got live fish on the boat, the 20 fish limit would apply. Even though, again, because they wouldn't have a bill of sale for that, there'd be live fish on the boat. It would apply in that circumstance. Again, once they're out off the dock with patrons or private.
Eric Reed?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. So the other part of it is you have an HMS permit, it's a federal permit. So you're supposed to report, and that needs to be clarified to a lot of people. So that permit plays into it as well. If you're going commercial tuna fishing and you catch a few mackerel, that has to be reported as well. So I'm glad Mr. Penny's a little confused. All the more reason to have a little bit of outreach would be my opinion. So thanks a lot.
Mike Bentley?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, the outreach piece is clearly necessary. I just want to make sure that the outreach we provide is consistent with the the understanding and intent of the council.
Jason?
And we may need to do a little more follow-up on that HMS because I'm not 100% sure that they have to report everything they catch. They may have a more tailored reporting requirement. So we'll research that also.
Thank you, Jason. Any more questions or comments? Seeing none, Sonny, go ahead. Did you put your hand up, Sonny?
I did. I must be having trouble with my hand,
Okay.
so my hand should be up. But yeah, so just a clarification, what we're saying is if you're commercial or HMS, you need to report the mackerel. But if you're recreational, we're dependent on MRIT for the reporting. Is that what we're saying?
Jason?
I mean, I'm not sure about the HMS question, first of all. That's a separate, that would require some additional digging. But yeah, I mean, clarifying commercial and for hire are required to report if they're catching mackerel. But for hire, if they just have a few flats of mackerel for bait, that doesn't necessarily trigger the permitting or the reporting that goes along with permitting. For overall rec catch estimation, MRIP may be used both. I mean, MRIP currently is also used for estimating for hire catch currently. We use the effort estimates off the VTRs for those vessels that submit VTRs. There are efforts underway at ACCSP to try to utilize logbooks for the catch component also, but that's a work in progress.
Good, Sonny.
I think I understand. Okay. I was just a little confused with the motion on who actually has to report mackerel. Thank you.
Seeing no more questions, let's see if we can get a unanimous consent on this one, possibly. Any objections to the motion? Any abstentions? Seeing none, the motion passes by unanimous consent. But we're going to let Jason finish typing up the last motion. And we now have a motion. Would anybody like to make this motion? Peter Hughes?
Yeah, but Jason, should it say in the motion, I move to submit to National Marine Fisheries Service? Okay, reading into the record, I move to submit to National Marine Fisheries Service the Mackerel Rebuilding 2.0 amendment. That is not a committee motion. That would require a second, Mr. Chair.
Second, Joe Semino. Anything you'd like to add, Joe, to this? I think this is pretty straightforward now with what we need to do. Is there any comments or questions on the motion? Any objections to the motion? Any abstentions from the motion? One abstention. Motion passes by semi-unanimous consent with one abstention. Thank you for the committee for all your hard work. Jason, thank you for your help. Chris has one thing you'd like to announce before we take a break.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. In a room very close to us, I think actually over there, the wind developers have set up shop, some of them. Obviously, they're not on the agenda for this meeting, but they thought they'd take advantage of us being here to interact with you during the breaks. So if you have time, if you're interested, they're over there and go ahead, meet them. Thanks.
Let's take about a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 11:10 and try and get as many things done as we can before lunch. Thank you. 2 minutes, 2-minute warning, guys, 2 minutes. All right, everybody, welcome back to this morning's meeting. We're now going to do a presentation on longfin squid 2023 review. Jason Didden, if you're ready.
Thank you. Again, review, no action necessary, but the council can recommend changes if appropriate. I'm going to talk about a little input from the AP, the SSC, and the monitoring committee, and then touch on a little recent data. AP input, prices returning for longfin squid to pre-COVID levels. They definitely see fuel as a factor, potentially limiting effort now. So that will kind of be not looking at past landings, but we'll think about that in the future, I'm sure. Continuing to flag, there are a number of limitations that, the squid fishery may not be hitting its quota, but different gear restricted areas and the like limit, do limit their ability to prosecute the fishery as they would if unrestricted. They flagged kind of a gear code issue that's being introduced, VTR and Observer of some large mesh belly panel, just to try to get the word out that that's a new gear type code. Continuing to flag concerns about how turtles and separately wind farms may impact the fishery in the future. And then we have management track and research track longfin squid assessments upcoming. A lot of concern about that, given some of the difficulties with the ILIX assessment. That as a side note, I think we'll have a report for the August meeting on a post-mortem on the ILIX assessment that the council sponsored. The facilitator who helped out with that at the end is also doing a report, kind of evaluation of that process. So looking forward to that in the future. So the SSC had no recommended changes. Again, we're in multi-year specs. Monitoring committee followed suit. Just quick recent catches. The catches last year were fairly similar to the 07 to 20 average. There is that decline in the 2000s, but in the 2010s, things have been, kind of vacillating around that average. You see that big 2020 price drop due to COVID that the AP has mentioned before, and then the rebound in 2021. From the AP, it sounds like that continues to rebound. So these are catches this year, trimester 1, similar pattern, but up a bit from trimester 1 last year. Trimester 2 is just starting, fairly similar pattern. Survey data, the survey, again, these are just weight per tow from the spring and fall survey, continuing the pattern of variability. The terminal years there, 2021, were on the high range, but again, just continued variability there. So no action is needed for longfin squid. We're in multi-year specs. I can take questions if there are any. Thank you.
Any questions for Jason on longfin squid? Jeff Kalen?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the council. Can I just ask a question to Jason through you, Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I noticed that the Groundfish Committee up in New England, and I'm glad Chairman Reed is on, he might have some insight, is proposing a sub-ACL for winter flounder on the squid fishery. The motion was silent on which squid fishery. I assume it was the longfin fishery. And I just wanted to alert the council to this proposal. I'll be in New England up in Portland for that at the end of the month. I had to stay here for something tonight. That's why I'm not with you today. But I wanted to flag it for everybody as something that potentially could negatively impact the squid fishery. And I just wondered if Jason had heard from any of the analysts up there to compare notes on the bycatch data that you might have, Jason. I think this is a 5% bycatch trigger that they're looking at up there. There is an ACL for the scallop fishery. So I don't expect any resolution today, Mr. Chairman, but I just wanted to mention the issue as one of emerging concern for the loligo fishery in this region. Thank you.
Yeah, Megan Lapp actually forwarded me that a few days ago. I haven't had a chance to formally follow up, but I mean, it keeps coming up, different ground fish species that are kind of in this other category and potential limits, whether it's summer flounder or squid. It's kind of a recurring issue that, yeah, I'll be engaging with New England staff on.
No doubt. Thank you, Jason. Thanks for letting me comment on this, Mr. Chairman.
Eric Reed?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. The AP met, I think it was last week, and there was a motion passed at the AP to request a better analysis, a little clarification on exactly where the bycatch of winter flounder is in the loligo fishery. It's a little bit unclear to me where they're coming from, but that motion passed the AP. The Groundfish Committee meets next week, and I'm sure there'll be some discussion at that, and you're all welcome to listen in. I don't know if that's a webinar or not. Maybe you can't listen in, sorry. But yeah, that's going to need a little bit more look before it goes much further. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Nicola Meserve?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to take this opportunity to raise a flag about a trend that we're seeing in Massachusetts for an increase in directed for hire trips for squid. It seems to be becoming a staple of a certain segment of the for hire industry, perhaps as access is reduced to other species like sea bass and need to diversify. But we're seeing this more so in social media posts and directly from for hire captains, and it's kind of anecdotal information for now since MRIP doesn't sample outside of finfish, but I just wanted to kind of raise that flag that the assumption of negligible recreational harvest may be something that warrants an improvement in the future. Thank you.
Jason?
Yeah, we've kind of loosely tracked that there's both a private and for hire squid fishery. My qualitative Facebook research kind of suggests that, it exists. We don't have information on the quantity. Doesn't seem like it's substantial relative to the overall commercial quota. But yeah, since we don't have estimates on it, it is a bit of a question mark.
Any more questions for Jason? Seeing none, thank you, Jason. Our next agenda item, we need to adopt specifications for 2023-2025 chub mackerel. And Julia Beatty will be presenting.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. I think, Stephen's pulling up my presentation. I don't see it on the webinar yet, but I'm assuming it's coming. Okay, clicker. Where'd the clicker go? Yes. Okay. So, let's see. I'll just start talking and wait for this to advance. Stephen, the clicker isn't working yet. But the objective of this part of the meeting is to review recent fishery information for the chub mackerel fishery, review the specifications that were previously in place, the SSC, the AP, and monitoring committee recommendations, and then to recommend specifications for 2023 through 2025. So we do need to set a new cycle of specifications, but the recommendation from the SSC, the advisory panel, and the monitoring committee is just to keep everything the same as it was from the previous cycle. So status quo specifications. Slide's still not advancing. There we go. Are you controlling it, Stephen, or am I controlling it? Okay. No. I need to turn it on. There we go. Okay. So this slide shows commercial and recreational landings from 2002 through 2021. Commercial is in the teal color and recreational is in yellow. You can see that for commercial landings, after remaining in most cases well below 500,000 pounds per year for a long time, commercial landings spiked to 5.25 million pounds in 2013, but they decreased to pre-2013 levels by 2016. On the recreational side of things, landings have been a lot lower than commercial, considering those years with the higher commercial landings. So at the scale of this figure, you can't really see it, but there's been an increase in recreational landings since 2015, and I have a later slide to kind of zoom in on that. This is the most recent quota monitoring report showing data through June 2nd. So this year's landings trajectory is in blue, last year's in yellow, and it's basically telling the same story as the previous figure, that commercial landings have been very low, and you can see the quota up at the top there. So commercial landings last year and this year are on track to be well below the quota. So far, less than 1% of the quota has been landed this year. A little bit of background on the commercial fishery. There's substantial overlap with the Ilex squid fishery in terms of the vessels that are responsible for the bulk of the commercial chub mackerel landings that have occurred over the past 20 plus years. Some of the same vessels fishing in the same time of year in some of the same areas as the Ilex squid fishery, but not all of the same areas. Some of the captains that have targeted chub mackerel in the past have described chub mackerel as a bailout species or an alternative fishery. And they've said that, you know, in the past, there's been a few years where they haven't been able to go after Ilex, and there was a lot of chub mackerel around. So it was really helpful for them to be able to switch over to that fishery, but they would prefer to go after Ilex when they can. 95% of the commercial landings over the past 20 years are coming from fewer than 5 vessels and fewer than 3 dealers. So depending on how you break down the data, you get into a lot of instances of confidential data. Federal VTRs suggest that about 91% of the landings are from bottom trawls and 9% from midwater trawls. Almost all of the commercial landings are coming from June through October. And the price per pound is variable, and on average over the past 20 years has been about 53 cents per pound. This figure is about zooming in on the recreational fishery. This is showing harvest and total discards, live and dead, and numbers of fish from MRIP. You can see that there's been increasing catches in the past 5-ish years. In the past, we suggested maybe this is due to better species identification, because we know that MRIP added chub mackerel to the list of core species that the samplers are trained on starting in 2017. We also, the council worked with partners at Garfo to create a small scombrid ID guide, which we distributed to, I believe, thousands of permit holders and
other interested parties. So we thought maybe people are identifying chub mackerel better. But as this trend has continued year to year, that rationale may not fully explain the increase. We don't have a definitive answer about what's happening here. Maybe it's increased availability. Maybe it's something else or a combination of things. But just whatever the reason is, we do see an increase in the recreational landings here. As you'll see on later slides, this is nowhere near an increase to the scale of causing an issue with the current specifications. And then there's just some statistics on the screen here about over the most recent 5 years. 56% of the harvest is coming from state waters, 44% from federal waters. Most of the harvest in the recreational fishery is coming from New York, followed by Rhode Island, New Jersey, and Connecticut. About 57% of private and recreational fishery, 38% party charter, and 5% from shore. And again, like the commercial fishery, most of the harvest is coming from the summer and early fall. And next, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Rago, I believe, is online to summarize the SSC's recommendations for ABCs.
Okay, thank you, Julia. Appreciate that. Thanks for the nice presentation. Yeah, there was no new information to inform specifications that are currently based on recent catches and expert judgment. Our experts haven't got any smarter in the meantime here, so we're recommending that we stay with the existing quota. We did notice that and note that the prospects for conventional stock assessment are really limited for the foreseeable future. We did note that the general productivity of this species in other areas of the world is reasonably well known, and that so that does help us to say, and we'll be included as part of our research recommendations. But it was we felt that the current catches in the Mid-Atlantic are unlikely to cause overfishing. And then finally, in view of the limited information, that all the national standards for best scientific information available are met under this criteria. Now, we did have a very long list of sources of uncertainty. Next slide, please. And I'll just this is the short list of what's in the report that you can read. But it's not really clear whether there's a range expansion going on with this resource, or just simply increase in overall abundance or overall detection. It is found in the Gulf of Mexico, but we really don't have a lot of information on stock structure. So as there is no fishery independent measure of abundance, and even the fishery dependent data are limited, particularly because this is, as Julia has noted, this is oftentimes an opportunistic species. It's an alternative species for ilex vessels, which are the ones capable of capturing or catching chub mackerel. So, again, the problems of low observer coverage and so forth. There was a diet study. This was reviewed the last time we did consider chub mackerel, and it revealed very low incidences of chub mackerel in the diets of major predators. By far a more common species was ilex. And of course, there is high uncertainty in the recreational catch. That is improving, as Julia noted, due to increased knowledge of the port agent, or the intercept agents that are doing the angler intercepts. And we had a long list of research recommendations, notably expansion of the current commercial fishing sampling. That has been, kind of a primary source through industry sponsored and SCEMFIS activities. That there would be some value in terms of doing a more comprehensive spatial and temporal analysis of all the data sources. This would include larval and egg data if available. But the big take-home message is, of course, that if there is going to be a research track assessment, or if we are going to improve the basis for this, that biological sampling should begin now. And information within the observer program and other sources of where these fish are being detected and quantities will be extraordinarily valuable as we start to piece together the story to help explain chub mackerel and possibly alter the current catch levels. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you. Return to you, Julia.
Thank you. So next, I will summarize how we take that ABC recommendation and then fill out the rest of the specifications flowchart for chub mackerel. And I have slides to walk through each of these things, but first I wanted to just show the high-level overview. We start with the ABC, and then to get to the ACL, which in this case, there's just one column here because for chub mackerel, there's no separate commercial and recreational catch or landings limits. So it's just one column, and it applies to both commercial and recreational. But something unique about chub mackerel is that the ABC applies to the whole East Coast, but the council, when they took final action on the chub mackerel amendment to add chub mackerel to the squid mackerel butterfish FMP, the council agreed that it was not necessary to implement further management measures in the South Atlantic. This is based on information suggesting that there was very limited targeted fishing effort there and input provided by the state of Florida that basically requested that the Mid-Atlantic Council not implement management measures that would impact the fisheries in the South Atlantic. But the SSC agreed that because of the likely distribution of the stock based on the limited information that we do have available, it's probably one stock along the whole East Coast, and it would make the most sense for the ABC to apply to the whole East Coast. So the way that we make those two things work is the ABC applies to catch from the whole East Coast, but then everything below the ABC applies just from Maine through North Carolina, and all the other requirements such as permit requirements and possession limits and things like that, those only apply Maine through North Carolina. So to get from the ABC to the ACL, we subtract a value to account for potential South Atlantic catch. And I'll walk through how we came up with that number there. And then again, that's how we get to the ACL and then the ACT and the TAL. So walking through those pieces one at a time, the value for expected South Atlantic catch that we've used in past years is 38 metric tons, which is intended as a conservative estimate. It was purposely set at a higher value than most years of data from the South Atlantic. It only represents about 2% of the ABC, and it's based on the highest commercial and recreational landings from 1998 through 2017, because this value was set at the time that we were going through the chub mackerel amendment. And then that value was increased by about 10% to account for discards, which we have pretty limited information on. So considering more recent data from 2018 on, suggests that catch in the South Atlantic has remained well below that amount. But again, this was intended to be a conservative estimate. It was intended to be higher than what we would expect in most years to allow for catch in the South Atlantic to vary and not really cause problems with the rest of the specifications. So based on a review of this information, the monitoring committee recommended no changes to how we set the ACL for the upcoming 3 years. So next, we derive the annual catch target from the annual catch limit by applying a buffer for management uncertainty. And the council previously used a 4% reduction to account for management uncertainty. And this was, at the time, related to concerns such as chub mackerel hadn't been managed this way before. But it wasn't based on a quantitative analysis. It was based on considerations of the size of this buffer plus the size of an additional buffer for discards just seemed like an overall reasonable amount. And we don't have any information to suggest that this needs to change. We don't have any information to suggest that this value has been problematic. So the recommendation is to continue this same buffer in the upcoming specifications. So next we derive the landings limit from the catch limits. So to get to the total allowable landings limit, we subtract expected discards from the ACT. For chub mackerel, we don't have any expanded discard estimates. And in the past, we just did a very rough analysis of observer data to think about how much chub mackerel might be discarded. And there's an update of that analysis on the screen here. And it's just a very simple analysis of all the chub mackerel that were observed in the observer data, what percentage of that total was discarded. And you can see it kind of varies across time periods. In the value that we used in the past was based on the overall percentage of discards that was seen in 2003 through 2017. And it's really driven by those years with higher catch, which again was 2013, 2014, and 2015. So as we've moved further away from those years, the most recent year of information suggests a higher overall percentage of discards, but a much lower overall total amount of catch. And since the ABC and everything that flows from it is loosely based on years with high catch, we're not saying that the discard percentage has to be updated to the most recent percentages, because that wouldn't be entirely appropriate, because the issue with using this based on a rate as opposed to a total overall amount, and since the ABC again is loosely based on that year with the highest landings, and then in the years with higher landings we see a lower overall discard percent, we didn't think there was any reason to change this assumption of a 6% reduction in the ACT to get to the TAL. Again, it hasn't been causing any issues. Landings have been way below the TAL. So the monitoring committee recommends no changes to this at this point in time, but they did discuss that it would be, preferable to have a more robust analysis of chub mackerel discards in the future, and it would be helpful to have expanded discard estimates based on the standardized bycatch reporting methodology, so then we don't have to do this really rough back of the envelope approach here. But again, it hasn't been causing any problems in the fishery so far, and landings have been well below this limit, so we don't see any reason to change it right now. The next measure that can be modified through specifications are the possession limits. There's currently no possession limit in the commercial fishery until 90 or 100% of the TAL is projected to be landed. So this is essentially like a proactive AM. And ever since we've implemented these measures, we haven't come anywhere close to triggering these limits. And on the recreational side, there's no recreational possession limit. I don't know that I need to go into the details on the slide here, but there's a little bit of background about how we chose those possession limits, the 40,000 pounds and the 10,000 pounds. Along the same lines as everything else, we don't have any information to suggest that those have been problematic or that they would need to change based on more recent information. More recent data isn't really telling us a drastically different story than the information that we had available at the time when we first set these limits. So the recommendation is to just leave this part of the specifications unchanged as well. Next, I will summarize what advisors had to say. A few advisors noted that the commercial fleet has not targeted chub mackerel in recent years because they've been focusing on Ilex instead. So I kind of already hinted at this, that the vessels that are responsible for most of the chub mackerel landings in the past, they would prefer to go after Ilex, and Ilex has been doing really well in recent years. So they haven't been focusing on chub mackerel, and you can see that in the data that the chub mackerel landings are very low. Advisors discussed that the increasing recreational catches are likely due to increased availability with warming waters. Advisors recommended no changes to any of the management measures for 2023. They agreed that there's no data to suggest that any changes are needed. And one advisor said that if we're setting specifications for 3 years at a time, when we go through this again 3 years from now, hopefully we can have more information to help us make those decisions at that point in the future. But right now, advisors seem to be in agreement that there's no information that suggests that we need to change anything. A few advisors talked about chub mackerel as an emerging fishery in this region. A few advisors thought that management is overly precautionary for this species, and that the council should prioritize and support the development of sustainable emerging fisheries. And this is a way to help fisheries adapt to a changing environment by allowing them to take advantage of species that are becoming more prevalent in this region. One advisor recommended research on the range of chub mackerel, especially regarding climate change and how it kind of intersects with this idea of an emerging fishery. Lastly, this was a discussion that happened at the monitoring committee meeting, and it's sort of tangentially related to chub mackerel, but there was an AP member who participated in the monitoring committee meeting, and this AP member is associated with one of the dealers that's purchased chub mackerel in the past and has encouraged vessels to target chub mackerel in the past. But now he said that the company is more interested in exploring the potential for a thread herring fishery as an augment to the purse seine fishery. So, similar concept as chub mackerel as like an alternative fishery, but they would prefer to put more of their energies into thread herring in the future as opposed to chub mackerel. And this company did submit an application for an exempted fishing permit to try to explore the potential for a thread herring fishery. And this was discussed by the council last year. Revisions were requested to that EFP. It has not been resubmitted, but it's something that the company is potentially going to continue to pursue in the future. And in response to those comments, one monitoring committee member reminded the group that this will be the first case of considering an expanded fishery for a species that's designated as an ecosystem component under the Unmanaged Forage Omnibus Amendment, and therefore thorough consideration would be needed regarding the most appropriate process. You may recall during the forage amendment, the council agreed that that new fisheries could be developed with consideration of the impacts of those fisheries, but the council did not really spell out the details of the process that would be used to consider those impacts. So the first time that there's consideration of this, that it would need to be thought through how to do this in a way that meets the goals of the forage amendment. But that's, again, a sort of tangential issue, and the objective of this discussion is to recommend 2023 through 2025 specifications for chub mackerel. And again, all the groups involved, the SSC, the AP, the monitoring committee, recommend no changes from what was previously implemented. And I have a motion ready to go. We do need to set new specifications, so a motion is needed, and I have a motion ready to go to basically implement status quo specifications from the previous 3 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Let's see if we have any questions first. Peter Hughes?
Apologize, not a question. I was going to read a motion into the record when it popped up. Thanks.
All right, I'll catch you here in a second. Any questions at all? Seeing none, Julia, would you like to put the motion up on the board, please?
Stephen, can you pull up the motion? Okay. Stand by.
Peter?
So just to provide some clarity, this is not a committee motion, this is a motion that would require a second. Okay, so with that understanding, move to adopt status quo chub mackerel specifications for 2023 through 2025, including a 5.07 million pound ABC, a 4.99 million pound ACL, a 4.79 million pound ACT, and a 4.5 million pound TAL. This does require a second. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Do we have a second on the motion? Kate Wilkie? Peter, do you want to provide any rationale?
I think that the presentation we just saw provides a lot of rationale for the motion. Thank you.
I agree. Any questions on the motion? Seeing none, let's see if we can make this easy as well. Any objections to the motion? Any abstentions on the motion? Seeing none, it passes by unanimous consent. Julia, while you're still sitting right there, let's go through our next unmanaged commercial landing report.
Thank you. I'll again start talking while Stephen pulls up the presentation. So this next agenda item is a report on unmanaged commercial landings, which is something that the council requested annual updates on as a follow-up action from the Unmanaged Forage Omnibus Amendment. And the intent is to look for signs of developing unmanaged commercial fisheries, and then to decide if any further evaluation or consideration of a potential management response is needed. So the report itself is in the briefing materials, and what's included in the report is commercial landings of species in locations where they are not managed at the state or federal level from Maine through North Carolina. And in this case, managed means there's a commercial possession limit, size limit, seasonal closure, and or limited access. So if there's something like just a reporting requirement, but no restrictions on who can land the fish or how many they can land, then that doesn't count as managed. And the way we determined what met this definition is everything that was managed by a council or a commission or a state, we communicated with the other councils and the commission and all of the states to make sure that we captured this accurately. And we do update it every year. So we reach out to the states and say, in the past year, did you change any management measures in a way that would require us to change the filters for the report, basically? And the data comes from state-only and federal dealer data reports. That's from the ACCSP data warehouse. And I'll walk through the tables on the next few slides, but I also wanted to make sure to give a shout out to Sarah Turner at Garfo APSD, because she's the one who ran all the numbers and basically did all the work related to this. I'm just summarizing it, but she definitely deserves all the credit for doing the hard stuff. And I believe she's available on the webinar to answer any questions that you might have about the data. So in terms of the specific updates that were made in this version of the report compared to last year, is that this year we did filter out anything that was reported in the dealer data as coming from aquaculture. We did not do that in previous versions of the report, but we fixed that this year. Or Sarah fixed it. And then there's only 2 regulations at the state level that required changes to the filters. And one is that Virginia implemented a limited access Panayid shrimp fishery that started in August 2021. So we worked with staff at the VMRC to make sure we were accurately capturing that and then filtering out anything that was landed through that specific fishery. And then also Rhode Island implemented sand lance measures that became effective in 2021. And again, every year we reach out to the states and make sure that we're capturing this accurately. So if there's any changes that were implemented for 2022, that will be reflected in next year's version of the report. So not going to walk through this table. I know there's a ton of text on the screen here, but this is table 1 from the briefing materials. Just to kind of give a high-level summary of what it says. This is showing the top 25 unmanaged species ranked in order of highest to lowest average unmanaged landings from, I believe it's 2015 through 2021. The version on the slide here is showing fewer years just to make it slightly less terrible to squeeze it all in one slide, but there's a few more years of data in the briefing materials. And then the confidential data are marked with a C and are not included in the averages. Some kind of high-level takeaways from this table is that considering the most recent 3 years, blue catfish had the highest unmanaged commercial landings. This is an invasive species, and some states have programs to encourage harvest of the species. So it's a good thing to see them having high landings here, even if they are meeting the definition of unmanaged in many places. So that's the most recent 3 years. And then before that, from 2015 through 2018, mussels had the highest unmanaged landings each year. And then in addition, tonks, hagfish, and striped mullet were all in the top 5 each year during 2019 through 2021. The next table is the same thing, but just focusing on finfish species. So this, isn't necessarily telling all that different of a story. It just adds on a few additional species because it's only focusing on finfish. The next table in the document is showing ecosystem component species. So one of the goals of the report is to track commercial landings of the species that were designated as ecosystem components through the Unmanaged Forage Omnibus Amendment. And just to remind you, the council approved a 1,700-pound trip limit that applies to combined landings of over 50 ecosystem component species in federal waters in the Mid-Atlantic only. So, by the definition that we're using, this would technically count as managed in that area, but because, these were the Special Forage Amendment species, we wanted to track landings of them as well. So there's a possession limit that applies to combined landings, and there could still be some increases in landings to some extent, even if trips stayed within that possession limit. So that's something that we want to track as well. So there are over 50 species that meet this definition of ecosystem component through the Forage Amendment, but only a few of them actually show up in the dealer data, and that's what's shown on the screen here. And takeaways from this slide is that you can see there's a lot of instances of confidential data, several instances of no landings, and there's pretty low landings overall. I mean, that's my interpretation when I look at it. Some of the categories here could include species that would not fall under the ecosystem component definition just based on the way that they're grouped together, the way they're reported. So for example, mollusks unknown, herring unknown, that might include species that aren't technically part of the Forage Amendment, but just with the way they're reported, we have to aggregate them that way. Next, there's two tables in the document that help us think about, is any of this showing in signs of developing fisheries? And there's two ways of looking at that. One of the tables shows species with increasing rank order over time. So if you just rank them from highest to lowest unmanaged landings, which species made big moves up the list. And then another way to look at it is species with consistently increasing landings over time, which could just show more steady but smaller increases regardless of the scale or pace of the increase. So this table shows species with increasing rank order over the most recent few years. So these species include blue catfish, gray triggerfish, Atlantic cutlass fish, mullets, pigfish, cunner, and houndfish. And you can see on the slide here, even if some of these species might have had increasing rank order, with the exception of maybe blue catfish, that the overall landings aren't necessarily huge. But again, leave it to you all to think about if you want to dig further into any of this, or if you think this warrants any further consideration. This slide shows increasing landings each year, and there's some species that had both increasing landings and increasing rank order over the most recent few years. This includes Atlantic cutlass fish, mullets, and houndfish. And there's some other species that had increasing landings each year, but not increasing rank order. That includes sugar kelp, green crab, sea urchins, razor clams, blackfin tuna, shrimp unknown, and bank sea bass. And that's all we had. We just wanted to, again, give a high-level overview of the tables in the document. And there's not an action that's needed today. And you're welcome to ask further questions about anything in the report. Again, Sarah's online to help answer questions. But if you want us to dig into the data, and we might have to follow up with that, because I think we probably have a limited ability to kind of dig into the data on the fly here, but can definitely follow up if there's any specific questions that need that. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Any questions? Chris Pat Savage.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Julia, for the presentation. I have a question and a comment, and the question might involve some digging, so get an answer later. That's fine. On some of the species that have shown increasing trends in the last few years, are we also seeing an expansion in the number of states that those fish are being landed in, or are the landings kind of consistent as far as which states they're coming from.
This is Julia. That might, I'm assuming we'd have to look into that further. And I mean, Sarah, if you have an answer on the fly, you could raise your hand, but I'm assuming that we can get back to you on that.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I figured it's probably across the board be interesting to see. I guess a comment I have, from looking at this over the last several years, and this is a really useful way of kind of seeing trends in landings of unmanaged species, is I think something that like could come out of this, not necessarily management, but maybe some focus on research and monitoring of some of these species. And, just kind of thinking about Atlantic cutlass fish, which really wasn't much of a fishery until recently. Maybe for states and federal agencies to focus some fishery dependent sampling on that fishery, and maybe for researchers to maybe focus on some of these fish that are showing higher landings, to kind of get some baseline information on them in the event that either we or someone else feels the need to manage them. Thanks.
Peter Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Julie. The Cs in here, and I refer to your last slide, the Cs for the houndfish. The confidential information, is that from 3 sources or less?
Yes.
So that's less than 3 dealers or less than 3 participants in the fishery. Okay, thank you very much.
Dan Farnham.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chair. Julia, you list on the top 25 species, I see king whiting listed. Would that be like a misprint? Shouldn't they be reported or managed under the small mesh multi-species plan?
That's a difference in the English language. I think it's, we call them kingfish in New England. They're called, the guys in Fulton Market call them roundheads. It's Dewey could probably tell it better than me, but yeah, sea mull, it's a fish with 1,000 names. It's just a little fish that's about this big, it's not a whiting at all. It's a different fish, but they call them kingfish. That's why, and they call them whiting as well. So it's a totally different species.
Joe Semino.
Thank you. And thank you, Julia. This is always an interesting report. I'm not sure about the commercial landings for triggerfish, which I think this report does kind of seem to highlight. But I just wanted to make a note that New Jersey DEP is looking at some in-state management. We've begun the process for a blue crab FMP, which is long overdue. And when we took this idea out to the public, probably the one fish that we heard that they would like to see a fishery management plan for in New Jersey is gray triggerfish. So we're kind of getting that process started as well, and I just wanted to put that out there.
Thank you, Joe. James Fletcher. James Fletcher, we can't hear you. You want to try again? Yeah, I see your mute button's coming on and off, but we still can't hear you, James. Alrighty. Any more questions for Julia? Seeing none, somehow we managed to catch up. It is. We're going to have lunch on time, it looks like. Do I have any further notes? All right, let's plan on seeing everybody back. Oops, sorry, Jason.
I just neglected to pass along thanks to staff at Garfo in the Center for the Mackerel for building stuff. It started off as a framework. We didn't have an FMAT. The monitoring committee kind of pitched in. Kirsten did a lot of heavy lifting on runs, more runs, extra runs. So I didn't mention that, but I should have. Thanks.
Yep, thank you. All right, we will see everybody back here at 1 o'clock. Thank you.